Hello, hello. Welcome to our second installment of Storytime for Adults. As promised, at the end of the summer, we decided to do Storytime for Adults again, this time for the month of October. And since it is October and we're presently in the season of Halloween, we happen to have a seasonally appropriate theme as well. This month we'll be reading classic horror stories. So our story times will be appearing twice a week, every week for the entire month of October. Stories will post every Wednesday and Friday until October 30th. I will be reading every Friday, and on Wednesdays, Will, our teen library associate, will be reading stories as well. And I should say, took a look at his reading list, and he has some absolutely wonderful stories picked out for you guys. Some you may have heard of, most of the authors you may have heard of, but some of his stories, things you probably haven't read or heard before, and they are absolutely fabulous. They are worth your time, so please give them a listen if this at all interests you. So, I find horror as a genre to be quite interesting, and I think it's a lot broader and has more crossover appeal than most people think. When most people hear horror anymore, they think of slasher flicks, monster movies, and they certainly have their place in the horror genre, but horror is and always has been so much broader than that. So, of course, ghosts, ghouls, things that go bump in the night, those are definitely a part of horror as well. And they were sort of what we promised in our advertisement, so we will be getting to ghost stories tonight. This evening we'll be reading a couple of stories by two very different authors, Gertrude Atherton and H.G. Wells. The authors are different, the stories are very different, but they are both notably classic ghost stories. So who were they? Well, Gertrude Atherton lived from 1857 until 1948, notably living through the American Civil War and both World Wars. She was an American author of fiction and essays. She dealt with a huge range of topics from social issues and politics to war. Atherton was an outspoken suffragist and feminist. She was also an outspoken anti-communist and anti-socialist. Most disturbingly, however, she did have some very problematic views regarding race. She was openly a proponent of white supremacy. Of course, we will not be giving any oxygen to any sort of views like that, but I am mentioning them here and the fact that she had them in the spirit of transparency for all of this. Tonight we'll be reading The Striding Place by her. It was first published under the title The Twins in 1896. It's widely considered to be a classic of the genre and one of the best horror short stories written in English. Our other author is H.G. Wells, a name you have no doubt heard of. Wells lived from 1866 to 1946. He was an English writer, social critic, futurist, and along with Jules Verne, one of the two best-known fathers of science fiction. He was also nominated for the Nobel Prize in Literature 4 times. Notably, unlike Atherton, Wells was an outspoken and committed socialist for his entire life, who tended towards a very utopian and cosmopolitan view of society and the future. A great number of his predictions in science fiction, including manned flight, space travel, satellite communications, nuclear weapons, and television, all later came to pass. He was also the author of The War of the Worlds. That would later be turned into a radio play in 1938 in the United States by Orson Welles, who's not related to him despite the same last name, and caused a small panic among many radio listeners. Tonight, we will be reading by him The Red Room, first published also in 1896, and it is kind of unique in that it is a straight-up horror story by H.G. Wells. Everybody thinks of him for science fiction, but he's not a slouch when it came to scaring you either. So without any further ado, why don't we sort of dive right in and start with The Striding Place by Gertrude Atherton. Weigel, continental and detached, tired early from grouse shooting, to stand propped against a sod fence while his host's workmen routed up the birds with long poles and drove them towards the waiting guns, made him feel himself a parody on the ancestors who'd roamed the moors and forests of this West Riding of Yorkshire in hot pursuit of game worth the killing. But when in England in August, he always accepted whatever proffered for the season, and invited his host to shoot pheasants on his estates in the south. The amusements of life, he argued, should be accepted with the same philosophy as its ills. It had been a bad day. A heavy rain had made the moor so spongy that it fairly sprang beneath the feet. Whether or not the grouse had haunts of their own, wherein they were immune from rheumatism, the bag had been small. The women, too, were an unusually dull lot, with the exception of a new-minded debutante who bothered Weigel at dinner by demanding the verbal restoration of the vague paintings on the vaulted roof above them. But it was no one of these things that sat on Weigel's mind, as when the other men were up to bed, he let himself out of the castle and sauntered down to the river. His intimate friend, the companion of his boyhood, the chum of his college days, his fellow traveler in many lands, the man for whom he possessed stronger affection than for all men, had mysteriously disappeared 2 days ago, and his track might have sprung to the upper air for all the trace he had left behind him. He'd been a guest on the adjoining estate during the past week, shooting with the fervor of the true sportsman, making love in the intervals to Adeline Cavan, and apparently in the best of spirits. As far as was known, there was nothing to lower his mental mercury, for his rent roll was a large one. Miss Cavan blushed whenever he looked at her, and being one of the best shots in England, he was never happier than in August. The suicide theory was preposterous, all agreed, and there was as little reason to believe him murdered. Nevertheless, he'd walked out of March Abbey 2 nights ago without hat or overcoat, and had not been seen since. The country was being patrolled night and day. 100 keepers and workmen were beating the woods and poking the bogs and the moors, but as yet not so much as a handkerchief had been found. Weigel did not believe for a moment that Wyatt Gifford was dead, and although it was impossible not to be affected by the general uneasiness, he was disposed to be more angry than frightened. At Cambridge, Gifford had been an incorrigible practical joker, and by no means had outgrown the habit. It would be like him to cut across the country in his evening clothes, board a cattle train, and amuse himself touching up the picture of the sensation in West Riding. However, Weigel's affection for his friend was too deep to companion with tranquility in the present state of doubt, and instead of going to bed early with the other men, he determined to walk until ready for sleep. He went down to the river and followed the path through the woods. There was no moon, but the stars sprinkled their cold light upon the pretty belt of water flowing placidly past wood and ruin, between green masses of overhanging rocks or sloping banks tangled with tree and shrub, leaping occasionally over stones with the hush of an angry scold, to recover its equanimity the moment it was clear again. It was very dark in the depths where Weigel trod. He smiled as he recalled a remark of Gifford's. An English wood is like a good many other things in life. Very promising at a distance, but a hollow mockery when you get within. You see daylight on both sides, and the sun freckles the very bracken. Our woods need the night to make them seem what they ought to be, what they once were before our ancestors' descendants demanded so much more money in these so much more various days. Weigel strolled along, smoking and thinking of his friend. His pranks, many of which had done more credit to his imagination than this, and recalling conversation that had lasted the night through. Just before the end of the London season, they'd walked the streets one hot night after a party, discussing the various theories of the soul's destiny. That afternoon, they'd met at the coffin of a college friend whose mind had been blank for the past 3 years. Some months previously, they'd called at the asylum to see him. His expression had been senile, his face imprinted with the record of debauchery. In death, the face was placid, intelligent, without ignoble lineation, the face of the man they'd known at college. Weigel and Gifford had had no time to comment there, and the afternoon and evening were full, but coming forth from the house of festivity together, they had reverted almost at once to the topic. I cherish the theory, Gifford had said, that the soul sometimes lingers in the body after death. During madness, of course, it is an impotent prisoner, albeit a conscious one. Fancy its agony and its horror. What more natural than that when the life spark goes out? The tortured soul should take possession of the vacant skull and triumph once more for a few hours while old friends look their last. It has had time to repent, while compelled to crouch and behold the result of its work, and it has shriveled itself into a state of comparative purity. If I had my way, I should stay inside my bones until the coffin had gone into its niche, that I might obviate for my poor old comrade the tragic impersonality of death. And I should like to see justice done to it, as it were, to see it lowered among its ancestors with the ceremony and solemnity that are its due. I am afraid that if I discovered myself too quickly, I should yield to curiosity and hasten to investigate the mysteries of space. You believe in the soul as an independent entity, then, and that it and the vital principle are not one and the same. Absolutely. The body and soul are twins, like comrades. Sometimes friends, sometimes enemies, but always loyal in the last instance. Someday, when I'm tired of the world, I should go to India and become a Mahatma, solely for the pleasure of receiving proof during life of this independent relationship. Suppose you were not sealed up properly and returned after one of your astral flights to find your earthly parts unfit for habitation. It is an experiment I don't think I should care to try, unless even juggling with soul and flesh impaled. That would be an interesting predicament. I should rather enjoy experimenting with broken machinery. The high, wild roar of water smote suddenly upon Wygo's ear and checked his memories. He left the wood and walked out on the huge slippery stones which nearly close the river wharf at this point, and watched the waters boil down into the narrow pass with their furious, untiring energy. The black quiet of the woods rose high on either side. The stars seemed colder and whiter just above. On either hand, the perspective of the river might have run into a rayless cavern. It was no lonelier spot in England, nor one which had the right to claim so many ghosts, if ghosts there were. Wygo was not a coward, but he recalled uncomfortably the tales of those that had been done to death in the Strid. Wordsworth's boy of Egremont had been disposed of by the practical Whitaker, but countless others, more venturesome than wise, had gone down into that narrow boiling course, never to appear in the still pool a few yards beyond. Below the great rocks which formed the walls of the Strid was believed to be a natural vault, onto whose shelves the dead were thrown. The spot had an ugly fascination. Wygo stood, visioning skeletons uncoffined in green, the home of the eyeless things which had devoured all that had covered and filled that rattling symbol of man's mortality, then fell to the wondering if anyone had attempted to leap the Strid of late. It was covered with slime. He'd never seen it look so treacherous. He shuddered and turned away, impelled despite his manhood to flee the spot. As he did so, something tossing in the foam below the fall, something as white yet independent of it, caught his eye and arrested his step. Then he saw that it was describing a contrary motion to the rushing water, an upward-backward motion. Wygo stood rigid, breathless. He fancied he heard the crackling of his hair. Was that a hand? It thrust itself still higher above the boiling foam, turning sidewise, and 4 frantic fingers were distinctly visible against the black rock beyond. Wygo's superstitious terror left him. A man was there, struggling to free himself from the suction beneath the Strid. Swept down, doubtless, but a moment before his arrival, perhaps as he stood with his back to the current. He stepped as close to the edge as he dared. The hand doubled as if in imprecation, shaking savagely in the face of that force which leaves its creatures to immutable law, then spread again wide, clutching, expanding, crying for help as audibly as the human voice. Wygo dashed to the nearest tree, dragging and twisting off a branch with his strong arms, and returning as swiftly to the Strid. The hand was in the same place, still gesticulating as wildly. The body was undoubtedly caught in the rocks below, perhaps already halfway along one of those hideous shelves. Wygo let himself down upon a lower rock, bracing his shoulder against the mass beside him, then, leaning out over the water, thrust the branch into the hand. The fingers clutched it convulsively. Wygo tugged powerfully, his own feet dragging perilously near the edge. For a moment he produced no impression. Then an arm shot above the water. The blood sprang to Wygo's head. He was choked with the impression that the Strid had him in her roaring hold, and he saw nothing. Then the mist cleared. The hand and arm were nearer, although the rest of the body was still concealed by the foam. Wygo peered out with distended eyes. The meager light revealed in the cuffs links of a peculiar device. The fingers clutching the branch were as familiar. Wygo forgot the slippery stones, the terrible death if he stepped too far. He pulled with passionate will and muscle. Memories flung themselves into the hot light of his brain, trooping rapidly upon each other's heels, as in the thought of the drowning. Most of the pleasures of his life, good and bad, were identified in some way with this friend. Scenes of college days, of travel where they had deliberately sought adventure and stood between one another and death upon more occasions than one, the hours of delightful companionship among the treasures of art, and others in the pursuit of pleasure, flashed like the changing particles of a kaleidoscope. Weigel had loved several women, and he would have flouted in these moments the thought that he'd ever loved any woman as he loved Wyatt Gifford. There were so many charming women in the world, and in the 32 years of his life he'd never known another man to whom he cared to give his intimate friendship. He threw himself on his face. His wrists were cracking. The skin was torn from his hands, the fingers still gripping the stick. There was life in them yet. Suddenly, something gave way. The hand swung about, tearing the branch from Weigel's grasp. The body had been liberated and flung outward, though still submerged by the foam and spray. Weigel scrambled to his feet and sprang along the rocks, knowing that the danger from suction was over and that Gifford must be carried straight to the quiet pool. Gifford was a fish in the water and could live under it longer than most men. If he survived this, it would not be the first time that his pluck and science had saved him from drowning. Weigel had reached the pool. A man in his evening clothes floated on it, his face turned toward a projecting rock over which his arm had fallen, upholding the body. The hand that had held the branch hung limply over the rock, its white reflection visible in the black water. Weigel plunged into the shallow pool, lifted Gifford in his arms, and returned to the bank. He laid the body down and threw off his coat that he might be the freer to practice the methods of resuscitation. He was glad of the moment's respite. The valiant life of the man might have been exhausted in that last struggle. He had not dared to look at his face, to put his ear to his heart. The hesitation lasted but a moment. There was no time to lose. He turned to his prostrate friend. As he did so, something strange and disagreeable smote his senses. For a half moment, he did not appreciate its nature. Then his teeth clacked together, his feet, his outstretched arms pointed towards the woods, but he sprang to the side of the man and bent down and peered into his face. There was no face. That was The Striding Place by Gertrude Atherton, first published 1896 under the title The Twins. And next, submitted for your approval, we will be reading The Red Room by H.G. Wells, also published on the other side of the Atlantic in that same year of 1896. The Red Room. I can assure you, said I, that I will take a very tangible ghost to frighten me, and I stood up over the fire with my glass in my hand. It is your own choosing, said the man with the withered arm, and glanced at me askance. 28 years, said I have lived, and never a ghost have I seen as yet. The old woman sat staring hard into the fire, her pale eyes wide open. Aye, she broke in, and 28 years you've lived and never seen the likes of this house, I reckon. There are many things to see when one's still but 28. She swayed her head slowly from side to side. Many things to see and sorrow for. I have suspected the old people were trying to enhance the spiritual terrors of their house by their droning insistence. I put down my empty glass on the table and looked about the room, and caught a glimpse of myself, abbreviated and broadened to an impossible sturdiness, in the queer old mirror at the end of the room. Well, I said, if I see anything tonight, I shall be so much the wiser, for I come to the business with an open mind. It's your own choosing, said the man with the withered arm once more. I heard the sound of a stick and a shambling on the steps of the flags in the passage outside, and the door creaking on its hinges as a second old man entered, more bent, more wrinkled, more aged even than the first. He supported himself by a single crutch. His eyes were covered by a shade, and his lower lip, half averted, hung pale and pink from his decaying yellow teeth. He made straight for an armchair on the opposite side of the table, sat down clumsily, and began to cough. The man with the withered arm gave this newcomer a short glance of positive dislike. The old woman took no notice of his arrival, but remained with her eyes fixed steadily on the fire. I said, it's your own choosing, said the man with the withered arm, when the coughing had ceased for a while. It's my own choosing, I answered. The man with the shade became aware of my presence for the first time, and threw his head back for a moment and sideways to see me. I caught a momentary glimpse of his eyes, small and bright and inflamed. Then he began to cough and splutter again. "Why don't you drink?" said the man with the withered arm, pushing the beer towards him. The man with the shade poured out a glassful with a shaky arm and splashed half as much again on the deal table. A monstrous shadow of him crouched among the wall, and mocking his actions as he poured and drank. I must confess I had scarce expected these grotesque custodians. These, to my mind, something inhuman in senility, something crouching and atavistic. The human qualities seemed to drop from old people insensibly day by day. The three of them made me feel uncomfortable with their gaunt silences, their bent carriage, their evident unfriendliness to me and one another. "If," said I, "you will show me to this haunted room of yours, I will make myself comfortable there." The old man with a cough jerked his head back so suddenly that it startled me, and shot another glance of his red eyes at me from under the shade, but no one answered me. I waited a minute, glancing from one to the other. "If," I said a little louder, "if you will show me to this haunted room of yours, I will relieve you from your task of entertaining me." "There's a candle on the slab outside the door," said the man with the withered arm, looking at my feet as he addressed me. "But if you go to the Red Room tonight—" "This night of all nights," said the old woman, "you go alone." "Very well," I answered. "And which way do I go?" "You go along the passage for a bit," she said, "until you come to a door, and through that to a spiral staircase, and halfway up that to a landing, and another door covered in baize. Go through that, and down the long corridor to the end, and the Red Room is on your left up the steps." "Have I got that right?" I said, and repeated his directions. He corrected me in one particular. "And are you really going?" said the woman from the shade, looking at me again for the third time with that queer, unnatural tilting of the face. Excuse me. "This night of all nights," said the old woman. "It is what I came for," I said, and moved towards the door. As I did so, the old man with the shade staggered around the table so as to be closer to the others, to the fire. At the door I turned and looked at them, and saw they were all close together, dark against the firelight, staring at me over their shoulders with an intense expression on their ancient faces. "Good night," I said, setting the door open. "It's your own choosing," said the man with the withered arm. I left the door wide open until the candle was well lit, and then I shut them in and walked down the chilly, echoing passage. I must confess that the oddness of the three old pensioners in whose charge her ladyship had left the castle, and the deep-throned, old-fashioned furniture of the housekeeper's room in which they foregathered, affected me in spite of my efforts to keep myself at a matter-of-fact phase. They seemed to belong to another age, an older age, an age when things spiritual were different from this of ours, less certain, an age when omens and witches were credible, and ghosts beyond denying. The very existence was spectral. The cut of their clothing, fashions born in dead brains, the ornaments and conveniences of the room about them were ghostly. Thoughts of vanished men, which still haunted rather than participated in the world of today. But with an effort, I sent such thoughts to the right about. The long, drafty subterranean passage was chilly and dusty, and my candle flared and made the shadows cower and quiver. The echoes ran up and down the spiral staircase, and the shadow came sweeping up after me, and one fled before me into the darkness overhead. I came to the landing and stopped there for a moment, listening to a rustling that I fancied I heard. Then, satisfied of the absolute silence, I pushed open the baize-covered door and stood in the corridor. The effect was scarcely what I expected. The moonlight, coming in by the great window on the grand staircase, picked out everything in vivid black shadow or silvery illumination. Everything was in its place. The house might have been deserted on the yesterday instead of 18 months ago. There were candles in the sockets of the sconces, and whatever dust had gathered on the carpets or upon the polished flooring was distributed so evenly as to be invisible in the moonlight. I was about to advance and stopped abruptly. A bronze group stood upon the landing, hidden from me by the corner of the wall, but its shadow fell with marvelous distinctness upon the white paneling and gave me the impression of someone crouching to waylay me. I stood rigid for half a minute, perhaps. Then, with my hand in the pocket that held my revolver, I advanced, only to discover a Ganymedean eagle glistening in the moonlight. That incident for a time restored my nerve, and a porcelain figure on a buhl table, whose head rocked silently as I passed him, scarcely startled me. The door to the Red Room and the steps up to it were in a shadowy corner. I moved my candle from side to side in order to see clearly the nature of the recess in which I stood before opening the door. Here it was, thought I, that my predecessor was found, and the memory of that story gave me a sudden twinge of apprehension. I glanced over my shoulder at the Ganymede in the moonlight, and opened the door of the Red Room rather hastily, with my face half turned to the pallid silence of the landing. I entered, closed the door behind me at once, turned the key I found in the lock within, and stood with the candle held aloft, surveying the scene of my vigil, the great Red Room of Lorraine Castle, in which the young Duke had died, or rather in which he had begun his dying, for he had opened the door and fallen headlong down the steps I had just ascended. That had been the end of his vigil, of his gallant attempt to conquer the ghostly tradition of the place, and never, I thought, had apoplexy better served the ends of superstition. And there were other and older stories that clung to the room, back to the half-credible beginnings of it all, the tale of a timid wife and the tragic end that came to her husband's jest of frightening her. And looking around that long shadowy room with its shadowy window bays, its recesses and alcoves, one could well understand the legends that had sprouted in its black corners, its germinating darkness. My candle was a little touch of light in its vastness that failed to pierce the opposite end of the room and left an ocean of mystery and suggestion beyond its island of light. I resolved to make a systematic examination of the place at once and dispel the fanciful suggestions of its obscurity before they obtained a hold upon me. After satisfying myself with the fastening of the door, I began to walk about the room, peering round each article of furniture, tucking up the valances of the bed and opening its curtains wide. I pulled up the blinds and examined the fastenings of the several windows before closing the shutters, leant forward and looked up the blackness of the wide chimney and tapped the dark oak paneling for any secret opening. There were 2 big mirrors in the room, each with a pair of sconces bearing candles, and on the mantel shelf, too, there were more candles in china candlesticks. All these I lit one after another. The fire was laid, an unexpected consideration from the old housekeeper, and I lit it to keep down any disposition to shiver, and when it was burning well, I stood round with my back to it and regarded the room again. I had put up a chintz-covered armchair and a table to form a kind of barricade before me, and on this lay my revolver, ready to hand. My precise examination had done me good, but I still found the remoter darkness of the place and its perfect stillness too stimulating for the imagination. The echoing of the stir and crackling of the fire was no sort of comfort for me. The shadow in the alcove, the end in particular, had that undefinable quality of its presence, that odd suggestion of a lurking thing living that comes so easily in silence and solitude. At last, to reassure myself, I walked with a candle into it and satisfied myself that there was nothing tangible there. I stood with the candle upon the floor of the alcove and left it in that position. By the time I was in a state of considerable nervous tension, although to my reason there was no adequate cause for the condition. My mind, however, was perfectly clear. I postulated quite unreservedly that nothing supernatural could happen, and to pass the time I began to string some rhymes together, Ingoldsby fashion, of the original legend of the place. A few I spoke aloud, but the echoes were not pleasant. For the same reason, I also abandoned after a time a conversation with myself upon the impossibility of ghosts and haunting. My mind reverted to the three old and distorted people downstairs, and I tried to keep it upon that topic. The somber reds and blacks of the room troubled me. Even with 7 candles, the place was merely dim. The one in the alcove flared in a draught, and the fire flickering kept the shadows and penumbra perpetually shifting and stirring. Casting about for remedy, I recalled the candles I'd seen in the passage, and with a slight effort walked out into the moonlight, carrying a candle and leaving the door open, and presently returned with as many as 10. These I put in various knickknacks of china with which the room was sparsely adorned, lit and placed where the shadows had lain deepest, some on the floor, some in the window recesses, until at last my 17 candles were so arranged that not an inch of the room had but the direct light of at least one of them. It occurred to me, when the ghost came, I had warned them not to trip over them. The room was now quite brightly illuminated. There's something very cheery and reassuring about these little streaming flames, and snuffing them gave me an occupation and afforded a reassuring sense of the passage of time. Even with that, however, the brooding expectation of the vigil weighed heavily upon me. It was after midnight that the candle in the alcove suddenly went out, and a black shadow sprang to its place there. I did not see the candle go out. I simply turned and saw that the darkness was there, as one might start and see the unexpected presence of a stranger. "By Jove," said I aloud, "that draught's a strong one." Taking the matches from the table, I walked across the room in a leisurely manner to relight the corner again. My first match would not strike, and as I succeeded with the second, something seemed to blink on the wall before me. I turned my head involuntarily and saw that the 2 candles on the little table by the fireplace were extinguished. I rose at once to my feet. "Odd," I said. "Did I do that myself with a flash of absent-mindedness?" I walked back, relit one, and as I did so, I saw the candle in the right sconce of one of the mirrors wink and go right out, and almost immediately its companion followed. There was no mistake about it. The flame vanished, as if the wicks had been suddenly nipped between a finger and a thumb, leaving the wick neither glowing nor smoking, but black. While I stood gaping, the candle at the foot of the bed went out, and the shadows seemed to take another step towards me. "This won't do," said I, and first one, and then another candle on the mantel-shelf followed. "What's up?" I cried, with a queer high note getting into my voice somehow. At that, the candle on the wardrobe went out, and the one I had relit in the alcove followed. "Steady on," I said. "These candles are wanted," speaking with a half-hysterical facetiousness, and scratching away at a match, the while for the mantel candlesticks. My hands trembled so much that twice I missed the rough paper of the matchbox. As the mantel emerged from darkness again, 2 candles in the remoter end of the window were eclipsed. But with the same match, I also relit the larger mirror candles and those on the floor near the doorway, so that, for the moment, I seemed to gain on the extinctions. But then in a volley, there vanished 4 lights at once in different corners of the room, and I struck another match in quivering haste, and stood hesitating whither to take it. As I stood undecided, an invisible hand seemed to sweep out the 2 candles on the table. With a cry of terror, I dashed at the alcove, then into the corner, then into the window, relighting 3, as 2 more vanished by the fireplace. Then, perceiving a better way, I dropped the matches on the iron-bound deed box in the corner and caught up the bedroom candlestick. With this, I avoided the delay of striking matches, but for all that the steady process of extinction went on, and the shadows I feared and fought against returned and crept in upon me. First a step gained on this side of me, and then on that. It was like a ragged storm cloud sweeping out the stars. Now and then one returned for a minute and was lost again. I was now almost frantic with the horror of the coming darkness, and my self-possession deserted me. I leaped, panting and disheveled, from candle to candle, in a vain struggle with a remorseless advance. I bruised myself on the thigh against the high table. I set a chair headlong. I stumbled and fell, and whisked the cloth from the table in my fall. A candle rolled away from me, and I snatched another as I rose. Abruptly this was blown out, as I swung it off the table, by the wind of my sudden movement, and immediately the 2 remaining candles followed. But there was light still in the room, a red light that staved off the shadows from me. "The fire!" Of course! I could still thrust my candle between the bars and relight it. I turned to where the flames were still dancing between the glowing coals, and splashing red reflections upon the furniture, made 2 steps towards the grate, and incontinently the flames dwindled and vanished. The glow vanished. The reflections rushed together and vanished, and as I thrust the candle between the bars, darkness closed upon me like the shutting of an eye, wrapping about me in a stifling embrace, sealed my vision, and crushed the last vestiges of reason from my brain. The candle fell from my hand. I flung out my arms in a vain effort to thrust that ponderous blackness away from me, and lifting up my voice, screamed with all my might, once, twice, thrice. Then I think I must have staggered to my feet. I thought suddenly of the moonlit corridor, and with my head bowed and my arms over my face, made run for the door. But I'd forgotten the exact position of the door, and struck myself heavily against the corner of the bed. I staggered back, turned, and was either struck or struck myself against some other bulky furniture. I have a vague memory of battering myself thus, to and fro in the darkness, of a cramped struggle, and of my own wild crying as I darted to and fro, of a heavy blow at last upon my forehead, a horrible sensation of falling that lasted an age, of my last frantic effort to keep my footing, and then I remember no more. I opened my eyes in daylight. My head was roughly bandaged, and the man with the withered arm was watching my face. I looked about me, trying to remember what had happened, and for a space I could not recollect. I rolled my eyes into the corner and saw the old woman, no longer abstracted, pouring out some drops of medicine from a little blue phial into a glass. "Where am I?" I asked. "I seem to remember you, and yet I cannot remember who you are." They told me then, and I heard of the haunted Red Room as one who hears a tale. "We found you at dawn," said he, "and there was blood on your forehead and lips." It was very slowly I recovered my memory of my experience. "You believe now," said the old man, "the room is haunted." He spoke no longer as one who greets an intruder, but as one who grieves for a broken friend. "Yes," said I, "the room is haunted." "And you have seen it, and we who have lived here all our lives have never set eyes upon it, because we've never dared. Tell us, is it truly the old Earl who—" "No," said I, "it's not." "I told you so," said the old lady with a glass in her hand. "'Tis his poor young countess who is frightened." "It is not," I said. "There's neither ghost of Earl nor ghost of Countess in that room. There's no ghost there at all, but worse, far worse." "Well?" they said. "The worst of all the things that haunt poor mortal man," said I. "And that is, in all its nakedness, fear. Fear that will not have light nor sound, that will not bear with reason, that deafens and darkens and overwhelms. It followed me through the corridor. It fought against me in the room." I stopped abruptly. There was an interval of silence. My hand went up to my bandages. Then the man with the shade sighed and spoke. "That it is," said he. "I knew that was it. A power of darkness. To put such a curse upon a woman. It lurks there always. You can feel it even in the daytime, even of a bright summer's day, in the hangings and the curtains, keeping behind you however you face it. In the dusk it creeps along the corridors and follows you, so that you dare not turn. There's fear in that room of hers, black fear, and there will be, so long as this house of sin endures." Was The Red Room by H.G. Wells, published 1896. I hope you all have enjoyed our stories this evening. If so, consider tuning in this coming Wednesday and perhaps Friday of next week as well. And we will have more stories for you. Good evening.